Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Lenses on the Pinelands, a journey of discovery. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight, and I'll be your MC for the evening. My name is Chris Kossoff, and I'm on the Board of Trustees of the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, which is a nonprofit dedicated to protecting the Pinelands. The Pinelands, for those of you who may not know, is a rich, beautiful, and critical area of New Jersey. It makes up 1/5 of the landmass of our state. The Pinelands Preservation Alliance is an organization for more than 30 years that has been an advocate to protect the Pinelands and ensure that its respectful use for the people of New Jersey so that it remains a resource for us for years to come. For the past 3 years, the Pinelands Preservation Alliance has hosted a photography contest for the Pinelands. Unfortunately, this year, because of the virus, the COVID, we haven't been able to have it. So we're doing this evening's presentation. And tonight will be made up, we'll be showing some photographs from the previous 3 years of photography contests. And you'll see just how magnificent this area of New Jersey is. So it's the photography contest actually attracted hundreds of photographers submitting thousands of pictures over those 3 years. And you'll see some of the best of those photographs tonight. And to take you on that tour, we are really honored to have Rich Lewis, who is a professional photographer and one of the truly premier photographers in the Pinelands. He's really quite extraordinary, and he'll be leading our tour tonight. Before we get to the tour, though, it's really a pleasure for me to introduce the CEO of the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, a man who has dedicated the last 20-something years to protecting the Pinelands and ensuring that it's used properly. He's tireless and relentless as an advocate for the Pinelands. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you the CEO of the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, Carlton Montgomery. Carlton?
Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's really wonderful to have so many people signing on tonight on a Friday evening. When I look at the names that I see on the screen, there are many familiar names and many people who are not familiar. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Pinelands Preservation Alliance, or PPA, as we call ourselves, for those who may not be as familiar with the organization and what we do. We were founded in 1989 to be the voice in many ways, but also the eyes and ears for people who care about nature and care about the Pinelands, so that those who have an interest in this area and have the opportunity to have an advocate for them before government agencies that are determining what gets built, what doesn't get built, what gets preserved, what doesn't get preserved, and how we take care of our public lands. So we are, in many ways, fundamentally an advocacy group and a constituency building group. We want to inform as many people as we possibly can about what an extraordinary treasure we have in the Pinelands, a place that is in many ways unique on Earth, and that if we lose it here, we will not find it again anywhere else. And as part of that effort, we maintain communications through emails and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and our website about things that are going on in the Pinelands. We also created Pinelands Adventures to take people on trips into the Pine Barrens, mostly paddling trips, canoeing and kayaking on our wonderful Pine Barren streams, but also other sorts of expeditions on the theory that people will learn to love this place and to care about it and to demand that their public officials do right by the Pinelands if they have experienced what a wonderful and beautiful place this is. We also have just this last year started a chemical-free sustainable farming operation at our headquarters in Vincenttown on land that was donated to PPA for this purpose. And it'll also be a place that people can come and learn about agriculture learn about how to grow fruits and vegetables in ways that are friendly to the environment, friendly to water quality, and to the to all of the plants and animals that we care about. So we are trying to present the Pinelands as a place of wilderness, but also a place where people live and where they grow and obtain sustenance. And to show how we can live side by side with the rest of nature in a sustainable and successful fashion if we're thoughtful and careful about it. So I hope that those of you who are not involved in our work yet become involved in our work as supporters of Pinelands Preservation Alliance or as activists. And we will welcome you into the community of those who are trying to make sure the Pinelands is here forever. Again, thank you for coming tonight. And it's a real honor to have your participation in this event.
Thank you very much, Carl. And then on a personal note, let me just add that I'm from central New Jersey and got involved a number of years ago in Pinelands Preservation Alliance and quickly was taken by how magnificent the area is as a place of recreation and a resource for the state. And it led to my ultimately being on the board of trustees of the organization because I feel so strongly in the work that they're doing and the need to protect this area. So it's a terrific organization. And now, without further ado, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Rich Lewis, the photographer who's going to take us on this tour tonight and show you some of what's so beautiful in the Pinelands. Rich and I have a long history together and done some photography together in the Pinelands. And I can tell you that Rich is one of the preeminent photographers in this area of the state. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Rich and let him take you on this tour. Rich, welcome.
Great, thanks, Chris. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's really exciting to be here. I'm going to share my screen and get the show started. But also want to say that Chris and I have chaired this photography exhibition for a number of years, since the beginning. And it's just been great to work with Chris and to be able to assemble, all this work on the Pinelands. So anyway, this is called Lenses on the Pinelands, a journey of discovery. And let's get started with it. Thanks, if I can get my computer going here. Okay, so first thing, just a little house cleaning thing. First couple things real quick. Get your phones out or get ready to take a screenshot if you do that with your computer, because when you see this little icon at the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, that means the information on the screen may be something you want to capture and hold on to. There's going to be some, good information about taking pictures in the pines and so on, along with these great examples. Anyway, so we'll do that. And there are a couple of things that I just want to let you know about is if you enter this contest, or everybody who's entered this contest so far has now been put, all the images, whether they were picked to hang up on the wall in the gallery or not, are on our online gallery. And we have, as you can see, if you look at the screen, we have 1,390 images in this gallery. And it's a great resource. You can find it at the web address is up at the top of my screen. It's pinelandsalliance.org/gallery. And you can go there and you can, it's a very, very searchable gallery. You can search on when the stuff was submitted, the photographer's name, title of the image, even just what the image is all about, like landscapes or wildlife or so on. And you also can be part of the fun by entering the exhibition yourself. Even though the exhibition has been postponed till next year, we are still accepting entries. And you can find out more information about that on the pinelandsphotoexhibit.org. And anyway, you can win over $2,000 in prizes, and all your images will be put into this gallery. We're basically building an amazing library of photography. So what are we going to talk about this evening? We're going to talk about four things. And the first thing, we'll talk a little bit about what are the Pinelands and a little bit of, a little bit more detail. And then we're going to give you some tips on photographing the pinelands. And these tips, doesn't matter if you have a expensive professional camera gear with, or whether you're just photographing with your cell phone. These photography tips, you'll be able to use them and take them with you out into the pines when you take pictures out there. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how to find locations. And then we're going to talk about equipment that you can use out there, recommended equipment. And that's about it. So let's get started. And the other thing too, just if you have questions or anything, hold them till the end. And what we're going to do is you can put them in the chat, and we do have people monitoring that, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end of this. So let's get started in talking about what are the Pinelands. Well, first off, sorry, but this ain't the Pinelands, okay? The Pinelands are a very different landscape than what we think of when we think of the national parks and so on. We don't have these majestic mountains. We don't have deep valleys. And really our only waterfall is water that spills over a beaver dam. So what some people think the pines are this. I've heard this described as the boring forest that you drive through on the way to the Jersey Shore. However, if you're willing to explore the pines, get off the main roads and so on, you'll find that it's actually a place of amazing beauty. And just like there's just so much there to be offered. And as we'll see tonight with these images, and pretty much all the images except mine are images that were submitted and are available in the gallery. But let's talk a little bit about a little, Pinelands, a little fact thing, a little, fun facts about the pines. And it was our nation's first national reserve, and it also has international recognition as a biosphere. So it's not just us local people who think it's a cool place. It is, as Chris said, it's huge. It's over 1 million acres, about 22% of the state. You can see the border line is the green line at the bottom of in South Jersey there. That is the Pinelands Reserve. And so what makes it different? What makes this special? There's these pine forests and coastal plains all up and down the eastern seaboard. Well, what makes us special is basically we have 17 trillion gallons of fresh water underneath this area. So think about, there's a pine forest with tons of water underneath it, and it's called the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer. And because we have all that water, we have all these river systems, and 2 of which are in the National Wild and Scenic River System. And hold on 1 second here. There's all these things popping up on my screen. And in addition, because of all this water, we support all kinds of life here, including all sorts of animals, plants, and definitely things that are rare, threatened, endangered. And there's even plants and things that grow here that you can't find anywhere else on the planet except for in the Pinelands. It's a wilderness shaped by human beings, which is, I find this one of these like interesting little quirky Pinelands facts, is the fact that if you travel back to the 18th century, you would find this was not a wilderness, but an industrial area. Unlike other areas that start out as wilderness and become cities and industrial areas, this was an industrial area back in the colonial days and into our early life as a nation. Iron forges, glass makers, and so on were here. And eventually, due to economic conditions and other things, these businesses went under, and the forest was left to preserve itself. And it's restored itself into the wonderful place we have today. And the reason why is because it's actually, the area is governed by what's known as the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan, or what we lovingly call the CMP, which limits growth and controls conservation and everything. It just makes, makes this place worthy, a way to preserve. So let's talk a little bit more about what are the Pinelands. And we're going to look at the different environments. There's 4 different environments in the Pinelands. And I just want to start out by giving you the warning is that I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a botanist, and I'm not a naturalist or anything like that. I'm a photographer. So what you're going to hear are the artistic definitions of these places as opposed to the more scientific. So The first area I want to talk about is the upland forest. These are the higher areas of the pinelands, which are really only a few feet above the lower areas of the pinelands. And these are basically the forest area, and the almost endless pine forests that make up the pinelands are just absolutely amazing places. When you really look at them, they're not that boring forests that you drive through on the way to the shore, but they're quite fascinating. And they're not just loaded with pine trees. There's other trees here as well in the pines. And just all sorts of beautiful landscapes within the pines that you can visit, you can see by driving through the area, hiking through the area, and so on. The second area of the pines, we have the upland forest, right? So now we have to have the lowlands, and these are the bogs, the savannas, and the marshes. And what happens when you have an area that has 17 trillion gallons of water underneath it is that when you have any kind of lowland, it's going to fill with water. And as a result, we have these beautiful bogs and so on that, that may have one time been cranberry bogs, or they may be natural bogs or whatever, but these absolutely, wonderful areas that, even if they were at one time used in farming, as they're left to recover into nature, you can see they kind of grow back and, become these beautiful sort of inland marshes and so on. And then we have savannas, these are kind of open meadows, and they're very, very remote, usually kind of difficult to get to because of where they're located. And they are just, they're basically wet meadows, where this looks like a kind of a grassy meadow. It's actually a very wet area. And it's here where you find a lot of the rare flowers and orchids and so on that grow in the pines. And then that flows all the way out. I mean, there's an entire water system that goes from the headwaters right out to the ocean. And as we get closer to the ocean, we get to the marshes, which is home to all sorts of birds and other types of animals as well. So speaking of water, we might as well talk about the waterways in the pines, which are the rivers, the branches, and the lakes. And branches are just a sort of the piney way of talking, a creek or a tributary to a river. So, from the headwaters, we have these narrow rivers that go through the pines. And if you've ever been on a Pinelands adventure trip or rented a canoe or kayak from them and gone down the rivers, you've seen what they look like. They're absolutely, these beautiful little twisty turny things with just so much plant life and other things growing along the side. It's like, just to me, one of the most amazing way to see the pines is from the water. And these along the way, you find these lakes and ponds and so on. And it's an interesting thing that there are no natural lakes in the Pinelands. Most of these, like Chatsworth Lake and this, which is Batstow Lake, were mill ponds for ancient, or the old iron forges or sawmills or something like that. And some of them are beaver ponds, but most of them are just sort of the remnants of the industrial age. And then as it flows out to the ocean, these rivers become even wider rivers and open areas like this. This is the Pinelands. This is Oyster Creek, and though you don't see a pine tree anywhere in sight, this is still considered part of the Pinelands environment. So the last one I want to talk about are probably one of the most unusual, and these are the cedar and hardwood swamps. These are kind of really unusual places. This is an Atlantic white cedar swamp, and it's these cedars need a lot of water to grow, and they grow in these areas, usually along waterways and so on, and they can be so thick that it's almost impossible to get through, and they can actually even block out the light. You can see even in this image, it's pretty much a sunny day, but not all the sunlight gets through. And to me, I spend a lot of time exploring these cedar swamps, and to me, they're almost like a primordial environment. When I look at a scene like this, I'm like, if a dinosaur wandered into this scene, it probably would look like it belonged there. I mean, they're just such amazing places, the way the light reflects through and so on. Unfortunately, another area that's difficult to get to as well. So one of the things that happens with these cedar swamps is that as water level changes due to environmental conditions, or even beaver dams, and the water level goes up in an area, the cedar trees will die off. And because cedar wood is so resistant to rot and everything else, these we call them ghost forests, will remain for years and years and years afterwards. And whereas like what we're looking at, I guess you would deem an environmental disaster, is actually yeah, just a quite an interesting thing to photograph, these old cedar trees. So let's talk about how to photograph the Pinelands. Okay, so, you know, as I said before, we don't have these mountains, you know, it's not, you're not gonna, it's not that kind of a point and shoot landscape. I mean, when you go out into the pines, generally you see something like this. And as a photographer, it's our job to kind of make order from this chaos. And I will say that basically working in the Pinelands, you know, as long as I have, and other people, I mean, there's a lot of other amazing photographers who work here, and we all admit it's a compositional challenge. And I tell people on my photography workshops and my photography students that if you can photograph the Pinelands, you can photograph anywhere, because it's not a point and shoot landscape like Death Valley or the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or something like that. But that doesn't mean it's not a beautiful place. And that doesn't mean you can't make exceptional photography here. It's just you need to work with it. And I'm going to give you some tips right now. So I've developed over the years something I call the Pinelands Composition Toolkit. And in this toolkit are 7 tools. We're going to go over these in a little bit more detail. And the first one is visual flow. And these are the normal, anybody who's studied photography knows about the rules or the tools of composition. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then there's the use of color, tonality, and texture, which is something the Pinelands is full of, and how we can use that. And then there's a concept called layering, which we'll talk about. And then the use of a foreground, middle ground, and background in your photography. The use of anchor points. And I will explain all this stuff. So just kind of go over it quickly so that you can kind of get a handle on that. And then the idea of orderliness, because the Pinelands, as we saw before in the previous image, are anything but orderly at times. And then using timing and mood in your photography. And you can see there's the little icon there, so you can take a picture of that. And then what I'll do now is move on to, anyway, somebody just scribbled on the screen there. So if we can get that removed, that would be good. Hold on one sec. Okay. Anyway, so moving right along. So let's talk about the first thing, which is visual flow. Okay, and my screen seems to be stuck. Okay, I'm back. So photographing the Pinelands, we're going to talk about visual flow. And so visual flow is basically your basic compositional stuff. So let's talk about that. We'll see some examples. And okay, so visual flow is basically providing a path through your image. And I can talk for hours on this particular concept of visual flow. But I'm going to, this is, a shorter presentation, and I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights as best I can. So essentially, it's providing a path through the image. And in this case, it's a literal path through the image where your eye follows this little roadway through these cedar trees and then into the background. It's that path that kind of, basically tells the viewer how to look at the image. Okay. And leading line, this is called a leading line. And these are, these are really good things to use, and they can be very subtle. Here the photographer used these shadows in bat's toe to create a leading line. It just directs the eye right into the photograph. Okay, and here's another use of a leading line. Very interesting use where that little streamlet that is leading into the bog here is a way for your eye to start and work your way into the image. And if you imagine, if you kind of put your hand over the bottom of the image and all you see is that little pond with the pine tree in the background, if you look at that, whereas it's a pretty image, your eye really doesn't quite know where to start in there. But yet using a little idea of a leading line like this really, really helps. Here's another aspect, which is the use of a diagonal line. I mean, the osprey is the diagonal line, but it's a fairly dramatic photo anyway, because you've got the osprey flying and you've got it holding a fish. but just by the fact that the photographer used a diagonal or, photographed the bird on a diagonal makes this image visually much more dramatic than if it was photographed at a different angle. Okay, then another compositional tool would be the use of repeating shapes, which is a great tool for the upland forests and the cedar swamps and so on. As you can see, these cedar trees, they're just the repeating trees. They're really, really visually pleasing to the eyes, and a great tool for that. And then the last thing here, and again, I'm just giving you the highlights here, but the idea of, we have all this water, so why not use it to our advantage? So here we have a beautiful scene, a beautiful fall scene along a pond. And the photographer is using the water to create a reflection of that scene. So now from the randomness of the forest, we actually now have some symmetry to this image because the reflection creates that symmetry in the image. And again, it makes it much easier to look at. It makes it much easier for the eye to follow through. So the next thing, what happens when we don't have these leading lines and all these other things that are compositional tools? Well, let's fall back on what the Pinelands is really good at, which is color, tonality, and texture. And here's an example of that. Here, the main thing that catches your eye and draws you into the image are these red maple trees growing in this swamp. And it's just absolutely, there's no real leading line here. There's no real visual flow. However, those colors really, really pull you into the image. And what else the photographer has done is actually balance the colors in this image, where the reds are, that's the primary thing, but it's balanced with the blue in the sky, and then the greens and the yellows in the foregrounds as well. Okay, here's another photograph using the same thing, but the colors are a bit more subtle. But still, there's a nice color balance here between the reds and the yellows and the greens. However, what you notice is when the colors are muted, what happens is it really brings to life the textures and of the forest, and really, really brings that out as like the primary thing. And when you talk about tonality, you got to talk about black and white. And here, when you deal with black and white images, the idea of having something that's very white and very black, and then all the shades in between, that gives the tonality to the image. So this image would be very, very stark if it wasn't for the mist in the background that kind of adds those gray tones and really, really softens this image and makes it, far more kind of, almost a very soothing type photograph. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is the idea of layering. And layering is kind of an advanced term, but just to give you an idea, layering is something, normally it's done with a telephoto lens, and it's used in areas like this. This obviously isn't the Pinelands, right? But it's, one thing we know about telephoto lenses is that they bring the background close. They magnify the background, but one of the effects of that is something that's called compression, and it makes everything look closer and closer together. So if you look at the ridge lines of these mountains, you see it's very pleasing for the eye to see these things look so close together like that. It's just kind of a visual thing. So you say, so Rich, how do I do this in the Pinelands? We don't have mountains. We don't have these repeating ridge lines. So we can be very innovative in the way we use layering as a tool. And here, the photographer use color and also lights and darks to do that. The first layer being these grasses in the foreground, second layer being the reflection of this beautiful sunset sky, and then the background image of the trees, and then the sky itself. So all in all, you've got this nice layering effect that has the exact same pleasing idea as if this was a bunch of ridge lines, but yet you can do this in the flat terrain of the Pinelands. And then here's another one that a photographer did where she used the grasses in this lake as kind of almost little mini ridge lines that lead you to this misty island in the background. So another thing, which is kind of the opposite of layering, is the idea of using a foreground, middle ground, and background. And that's more of a wide angle approach to a landscape. And an example of that is this, where this was taken with a very wide angle lens. And the idea, whereas layering kind of brings you into the image, this kind of shows you the entire expanse of it. And here the foreground is the bog or the pond in the foreground here that you see in front of you. And then the middle ground would be that old pump house. And then the background is the sky. And in the pines, which is normally a flat landscape like this, normally you would have a background of mountains or something like that. Because we don't have that, we do have a sky. And so when you have a dramatic sky like this one, it's a great background. But even this photo would still be good, even if there was just some white puffy clouds in the sky as well, because it acts as the sky can act as a really, really beautiful background. And then here's a really great use of foreground, middle ground, and background, probably one of the best I've ever seen, where the butterfly is your foreground and the background, which is the lake and the sky and the trees and everything, is the world that the butterfly lives in. So the photographer, instead of just doing a close-up of the butterfly, shows us exactly where the butterfly lives and what the butterfly, lives its life within. So it's a really fascinating photograph. Next, we'll talk about anchor points. Now, if you take a basic composition class, anchor points probably won't come in. However, in the Pinelands, they are a very, very useful tool. And here you've got the use of it. The anchor point in this image, the anchor points in this image are the 4 geese. When you look at that, your eye goes right to those geese, and then it goes out into the rest of the image. And if you were to eliminate the geese from the photograph, then what you would find is really it's just a nice misty image, but your eye again has nowhere to go. But by the use of an anchor point, you get to see the you get to focus on these geese and then work your way into the image. And then here's another one where the focus or the anchor point is actually at the end of your visual travel, where you kind of see the foreground here and you work your way to this sunrise. And then here's the last example. This is sort of a subtle example of an anchor point. And here the photographer is just using, whether he did this in post-processing or whether this is just the way the mist laid out in the scene, as you can see the anchor point being that pine tree in the background and that little clump of trees in the foreground. Because they stand out more, they become the anchor point for the rest of this image, which is kind of more of a soft minimalist type photograph. The next thing, as we'll talk about, is orderliness. And as we said before, the Pinelands can be somewhat chaotic, and finding order within disorder is really part of the trick. And once we find it, it's really, really a good thing. So, a couple little tricks, simple little things. So here, the photographer used this fallen cedar tree as a way to create order within disorder. I mean, and it's just simple things like that. It's a way for your eye to start the journey into the image. But just a little thing like this, it can be, I use the term disruptive, which is kind of almost the wrong term to use, because it's not. If anything, it's the exact opposite, because it really, really kind of creates a little bit of order into this image. The use of mist and fog to mask a busy background is a great way to create order in the Pinelands. And we do have our fair share of mist and fog in this very wet environment known as the pines. And here the photographer used focus to create orderliness, where if you imagine if this entire image was completely in focus, you would probably hardly see this mushroom. But because of the way the photographer used that, we see, we focus on this beautiful mushroom and see all the detail, and all the other stuff in the background just becomes sort of a nice background to view the mushroom on. All right, and then the next thing is timing and mood. This is the last thing. So I know you're thinking, and this is whenever I give this presentation on photographic Pinelands, I can almost read the minds of people, and that is that, oh yeah, you're telling me I can wake up. In order to get the right timing, is wake up at 4 a.m. and get out there and photograph a sunrise. Well, it's not a bad idea. However, it's not 100% necessary if that's not, if that's not your thing to wake up that early. However, obviously the mood of this image is quite dramatic because of all the color in the sky and the reflections. However, timing and mood can happen anytime during the day. I mean, here timing is catching this rare, what we call a fog bow. This is probably done sometime in the morning, but probably also well after the sun was up in the sky. And sometimes it's just movement here. The way this egret is positioning itself, it's almost like it's a sculpture, like an abstract sculpture. But this timing now creates just an incredibly artistic mood to this particular photograph. So photographing the Pinelands, you've got your 7 tools, okay? And you kind of get an idea of how you can you really make interesting images here. However, you don't have to use these tools one at a time. And I'm going to show you an example of what I call the multi-tool approach. You know, in this particular photograph, we have a visual flow in the curvy shape of this little river. And we also have the texture and the color in the colors in the sky, I mean, the colors in these trees and everything. And we also have the use of timing and mood by, in this particular case, my timing was using a very long shutter speed to kind of smooth out the water. And so you don't see the little waves in this river, but it kind of smooths it out. And it creates some orderliness. It also creates some mood as well, and provides a little bit more visual flow by giving you a nice reflection of some of the important parts of the photograph. So in photographing the Pinelands, what else? We looked at a lot of landscape photography pretty much, but you know, what else is there out there? There's plenty of stuff for pretty much whatever your photographic interest is. You know, and one is we talked before about the Pinelands being an industrial area. There's a lot of history out there, and you know, a lot of it's preserved, like the mansion here at Batstow Village. There's just other unique features like the lighthouse at Barnegat. There are some abandoned properties out there as well that can be photographed, as well as the ruins of our industrial past that are out there in parks and sometimes just in remote locations as well. You know, here's just another thing of the railroads that used to support the area as well. So if you are into panoramic photography, there's nothing like a flat landscape to really put together a panorama. And that's when you take multiple images of an area and then use software or whatever to splice the image together into a long panoramic image like this. And if panoramas aren't your thing and you like to get up close, there's just amazing opportunities for intimate landscapes where you take very small scenes of an area where you just, instead of taking in that whole big grand scene of the Pinelands, you find a nice little Pinelands area and take it in, you know, whether it's these cranberries floating or this, you know, these frosted plants here on the right and some of the other stuff we just saw before. But it's a great way to kind of zoom in. And if you really want to zoom in more and you're into macro photography, and for those of you who are not photographers in this group, macro photography is basically just a way of saying close-up photography. And there are special lenses that we use that focus very close. And you can see it, the pines are a great environment for the macro as well, whether you're doing plants or you find a very interesting artistic looking leaf, or even getting very close to a snake and photographing the scales on a snake. And if you're talking about macro, then we talk about the amazing plants that we have out here. And here's some right here. The top 2 images are some of our carnivorous plants. We've got the pitcher plant on the right, a sundew on the left, and some really interesting mushrooms out there. And of course, there's some more plants. There's a curly grass fern, which is on the right. And this is actually a pitcher plant flower. And then we have some lots of rare flowers. On the left is one of our 20 different varieties of orchids that are out there. I think there's 20, there may even be more. And then on the right is the rare swamp pink flower that appears only in the very, you know, not that many places, a highly endangered flower, and it only appears for a little bit in the beginning of the spring. Wildlife, an amazing place, particularly for birds. As you can see here, we have shorebirds, we have you know, predatory birds like eagles, we have wading birds and even songbirds, just so many birds. I mean, that there are to photograph. It's definitely a bird photographer or a bird watcher's paradise, as well as other animals as well. I mean, we have, you know, our furry mammals like the fox, we have bugs, you know, we have amphibians like a turtle, and just, you know, other creatures as well, more bugs, and our famous Pinelands tree frog, and the timber rattler. If you photograph people, I mean, there's an opportunity for that as well. You know, one of the things about being a reserve, as Carlton talked about in the beginning, is that it's not a preserve, it's not a national park. You go to a national park and the only people you run into are the guests there and the people who work there. as park employees. However, we are a reserve, and so there are people who live here, and the locals are if you're into photographing people, we have plenty of people who live here and make their living here to photograph. And then the last thing is I want to talk about is night photography. Many people think you got to go way out west to photograph at night. However, we have some really, really nice dark sky areas in the Pinelands, and it's a great area to photograph the Milky Way, stars or star trails as we have in this particular photograph, and so on. So how do we find this stuff? Okay. How do we photographers figure all this stuff out? Well, it's getting easier and easier. And two things that are really going to help that out are, if I can plug a book that I'm working on, which this will be out. It's a photography guide to the New Jersey Pinelands. And there are over 50 locations that are easy to get to, and complete instructions and everything that should be appearing and ready to purchase sometime in the spring. However, if you can't wait, the PPA has always had a map of the Pinelands, and they recently completely revamped it. And there's a picture of the front cover of it. It's available for the low, low price of $5. You can order it online from the PPA website. And in this, they did an amazing job of putting together what's out there, where all the parks are, where all the national forests are. If you're a hiker, where the trails are, the hiking trails and so on. And it's just a great resource for exploring the Pinelands. And it's only $5. So other ways of finding locations on your own. And that is, these are some of the locations that that a lot of people like to visit, and I'm going to kind of break them down into what they are. And these are the public lands out there, the federal, state, local parks and forests. We have our state forests, some of which are Wharton State Forest, which is the largest in New Jersey, Brendan Burn, Bass River, Belle Plaine State Forest. We also have our state parks. There's Double Trouble, Allaire, Island Beach State Park, and then down south is Parvin State Park. And there are others, but these are the bigger ones and the more popular ones. There are other parks that are not necessarily state-owned, like the Black Run Preserve, which is in Evesham Township, Wells Mills, and some of these other ones, which are county parks. We have the Edwin Forsyth National Wildlife Refuge, which is a national wildlife refuge, a great place and an easy place to photograph birds because you can drive through it. And then there are state and federal wildlife management areas as well. And we also have some nonprofits who own property. These are private property, but they're open to the public. And the New Jersey Conservation Foundation owns several properties in the Pinelands. The largest is the Franklin Parker Preserve, which is probably one of the more beautiful areas of the Pines. And the Nature Conservancy has Maurice River Bluffs and a couple other areas, mostly in the southern parts of the Pinelands. There are farms, cranberry bogs, and so on. Just as a caveat to that, that is private property. You're not supposed to wander around on those places. Some farms and the PPA offer tours during the cranberry harvest. And so that's the best way to see the harvest, as opposed to wandering around there and either getting in the way and hopefully not getting arrested. And then there are our historical locations. These are just some of them. We have White's Bog, which is a historic farming village, Batstow, restored Iron Forge and Milltown, beautiful area with a lot of hiking and a gorgeous lake around there as well. The Estelle Manor Park, you get a double whammy with that. We have a 19th century glasswork and a 20th century ammunition factory, ruins of both. Weymouth Furnace are two lighthouses, East Point and Barnegat Lighthouse. And then there's ruins and abandoned places all around the Pinelands to discover. So another way to find locations in the Pines is by using the internet. And one of the ways I do this, not just in the Pines, but everywhere, is they go on Google Images and they Google an area and all these photos come up, and you look around, you might find a photo you like, you click on it, and you see the website that the photo came from. Here, this would be a lucky find for someone who's looking to find a location to either photograph or watch wildlife. Here we have Wildlife Watchers and where to find, this not only is a picture of what the area looks like, but it also is a website that could be a valuable resource for you. Google Maps is a great way to find locations. And before back in the early days before a lot of the parks and forests were developed better, we used things like maps and so on to find our way around the Pinelands. But in this particular, this is just a photo from Google Maps, and it shows you, in here are some locations that might be interesting to explore for photography. The first one here, if you look at this particular thing here, it almost looks like somewhat of a scar. It doesn't look natural. If you look really hard, you can kind of see sort of a roadway around it. And what this is an abandoned cranberry bog. And, that might be an interesting thing to photograph. Another thing is in the waterway. These are waterways here, and you can see there's sort of these lake pond areas. These could be interesting. These are either beaver ponds or perhaps old mill ponds or something like that. And then the third one I want to bring your attention to is this, where you see these kind of openings in the trees, this sort of discolored area. This possibly could be a savanna or another type of open meadow. Okay. And the thing that kind of makes this area interesting is that we have a roadway near there. So it's not like you're hiking 100 miles through the middle of no place to get to these locations. We do have a roadway. However, just as a warning, just because there's a road there doesn't mean it provides easy access. And I mean that for two reasons, is that just because the roads are on the map doesn't mean they're drivable. At different times of year, some of these roads get very torn up, particularly in the winter time, and they may not be passable. And sometimes they're really tight. And if you drive through them, you can scratch up your car, everything. So just be very careful with that. And even because the Pines is an area with a lot of life, and particularly plant life, even the fact that some of these areas are so close to the road, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're still easy to get to. You might have to work your way through brambles and all sorts of other things to get there. However, it's a good way to explore locations and see what something is. And Google, and besides having maps, has an app called Google Earth, which you can download to your computer or your phone. And it's basically Google Maps with a little bit more information. There's better GPS information. They have you look up in the upper left-hand corner, you see a little slider there. You can actually go back in time and see aerial imagery, satellite imagery or aerial imagery, back to a certain period of time. And in this map, if you look at the lower left, you see 1995, that's the earliest of that. And there's other little tools there in Google Earth as well. As if you look at the little blue circles, those are photographs. You click on them and you can see what a photograph of that area looks like. So another useful tool that you can download for free. So let's talk a little bit about equipment. Okay, I'm going to start with photographic equipment. And as I said before, none of this stuff is necessary. Okay, if you're not a serious photographer or professional photographer, you don't need any of this stuff except the first item, and that's the camera. And a camera is something we have, like whether you have, that you walk around with thousands of dollars worth of professional gear out there, or whether your only camera is the camera in your phone, it doesn't matter. You can still, particularly modern phones, the cameras in these phones are just absolutely amazing. Take really, really great photographs. And even some of the photos we saw here tonight were actually photographed with an iPhone or some other smartphone. If you do use a camera with interchangeable lenses, these are the recommended lenses that I find I do pretty much 99% of my work in the Pines with. If you use a full frame camera, which is a more professional camera, that would be a 24 to 200 millimeter. What's known as an APS-C camera, which if you don't know what that is, but if you have sort of a camera that you probably paid under $1,000 for, and it has interchangeable lenses and it's really light and kind of small, it's probably that. We also call it a crop sensor camera. And so your lenses would be more like in the 18 to 150 range. And the only reason why there's a difference there is because the sensor on that second camera is smaller than the full frame camera. And because of that, it's less expensive to produce. And so the cameras can be, are generally a lot less expensive. However, it doesn't mean they're bad. I mean, they're wonderful cameras, and a great way for the non-serious photographer to really, really have a great time with photography. And then there's the micro four thirds is what they call it. These are really small, actually very professional cameras. They're half the size sensor of a full frame camera. So the lens range on that would be 12 to 100, which is exactly half of that. So they basically, all these lenses, they're different numbers, but they actually create the same image because they're putting the image on a smaller sensor. And if you have other interests like macro photography, wildlife photography, well, there's lenses that are particularly for that. And then of course, carrying your equipment, a backpack or something comfortable way to carry your stuff while you're walking around looking for photographs. Tripod and shutter release, they kind of work together. Some people love tripods, some people hate tripods. I'm in the tripod lover group. And one of the reasons why I like tripods is because it holds your camera perfectly still. And whereas that works really well in certain conditions, the other thing is when you're composing a photo, you get the exact same photo every time if you're playing around with exposure or how you're zooming in and out on the scene. Filters, if you use, and I know filters are something that you can apply after the fact in post-processing. However, you can also put filters on the front lens of your camera. And these are the three that I would recommend. One is the polarizer filter. If you don't know what that is, you can Google it, but it's a way to, particularly shooting around water, it eliminates glare and reflection. It's a filter that you can twist, and when you do that, the effect is different. Neutral density filter just basically darkens the picture for using longer shutter speeds for creative effects. And then a protection filter, where if you're clumsy like me and you end up dropping your equipment, a protection filter is just a glass filter that goes over the front of your camera lens. And if you end up dropping that lens, you end up breaking that, which is far less expensive than either replacing or repairing your lens because the front lens element gets cracked or broken. And then extra cards and batteries, nothing worse than coming onto that perfect scene and having your battery die. So having extra batteries and extra cards to store your photograph, those SD cards that go inside the camera. A rain cover in case it rains. It's also good protection against wind if the sand is blowing around or something like that. Microfiber towel is a great way to keep your camera clean and dust free. The reason why I recommend microfiber is because it won't scratch the finish on your camera. And then a garbage bag is a very useful thing, not just for carrying garbage, but if it's a windy day and stuff's blowing around, you need to change your lens. If you do it inside the garbage bag, you don't have to worry about once the lens is off your camera that you have to worry about dirt and dust getting inside the camera and wrecking up those sensitive electronic components. So how about equipment for you? When you're out there, whether you're hiking or taking pictures, the number one thing you can bring with you is your common sense, which is knowing what you can and can't do. Don't get yourself into a situation where you need to be rescued by walking further than you're capable of doing, or going to some place that you're unfamiliar and you end up getting lost or something like that. Always recommend dressing in layers when it's cold, as opposed to putting just a big heavy coat on, so that as the day warms up or anything, you can take layers off, put layers on to respond to change in temperature. Long pants are always a great thing out in the pines to protect, even in the summer, to protect yourself against some of our nasty bugs like ticks and chiggers. Sunglasses, sunscreen, footwear. Again, it's always good to protect your lower part of your body because that's where the ticks and chiggers like to get you. And so sturdy closed-toe shoes, gaiters, which if you don't know what a gaiter is, there's a picture of that on the right where you see the person with the blue sneakers on. A gaiter is kind of like a cloth thing that seals between the tops of your shoes and the bottom of your pants, and keeps things out, not just bugs, but also dust, dirt, water, and so on. Rubber boots, if you really like to explore the wet areas and you want to keep your feet dry. Muck boots are, they're expensive, but they're very, very comfortable and very, very, very well built. And then waders, if you're really serious, which are what fisher people use out there to keep themselves dry if you want to stand out in the water. Multi-tool is a great thing to have with you, whether you're a photographer or not, because it's not just a knife. So if you want to slice cheese on your sandwich for lunch or something like that, you also have other tools as well, which can be very useful to repair a tripod or fix a little loose screw on your camera or something like that. First aid kit, if you know how to use it, water and snacks so that you don't get hungry out there. GPS and a phone. Phones pretty much have GPSs on them, so that's a good way of locating yourself. And then bug repellent in the bug season, which is any time from the late spring through to the early fall. These are the stuff people use. Permethrin, which is the first one, is something you spray on your clothes. It's great repellent for ticks and chiggers. The other ones are for our flying insect friends like mosquitoes and biting flies. All three basically do the same thing. I happen to like the lemon eucalyptus because it's natural, and for me, it works. Okay, so thank you very much. And we're going to take questions in a minute, but just before we do that, I just want to remind you that most of the images that you saw tonight, or at least all the images that weren't mine, are just part of this amazing treasure trove of photography that we have on the Pinelands Alliance website. And you can get there, pinelandsalliance.org/gallery. And again, it's a very, very searchable, so you don't have to search through, over 1,300 images to find what you're looking for. And again, please take what you learned, go out and photograph the pines. Spring is coming, beautiful weather, beautiful things happen out there. Go out and take pictures and enter the photography contest. You can find out more information and what you need to do at pinelandsphotoexhibit.org. And you too can be in the gallery, and you too can qualify to win over $2,000 in prizes. So with that, I'm going to end, and I'm going to open it up for any questions that you might have to either, for either me or Carlton or Chris, or anything you want. And you can put those in the chat.
I think Becky is going to go through the.
So this is Becky. Jason's been capturing some questions too, and I think he's going to start. So go ahead, Jason.
Sure, I'll just do it by voice. Lisa asked, how do you get through cedar swamps?
That's a really good question. It's really just, it's a trick of doing it. I mean, one thing is it's always good to have a good pair of sturdy rubber boots on, because cedar swamps are swamps. They're wet, and you got to be careful where you walk. They may look like, you might see a little puddle, and that puddle you might sink up, to your knees or even further. So one of the ways I get through is I walk very slowly and very carefully. It's like, it's not like out there doing an exercise hike. And I always take a hiking pole out there with me as well to poke around to make sure that the ground I want to step on is actually going to support my weight, particularly when I'm going to be stepping in the water, just to make sure how deep it is. And then the other thing out there too is just, there's a lot of, there's sphagnum moss and some other plants that grow along the ground. And I always try to be very mindful of not stepping on things that are living, so try to be very careful. But it is, it's kind of takes a little practice, but the big thing is just make sure you have a really good pair of rubber boots with you.
And Barbara asked, what kind of flowers are in the savanna?
So, I mean, different savannas have different flowers. I am not a botanist by any stretch of the imagination, but I spent a lot of time last year exploring some savannas, and you can find, Jason, you could probably answer this question better than me, but there's a lot of the rare orchids that are out there. Some of the, the fringed orchids and rose begonias. In that photo that I showed, those little yellow flowers out there are the bog asphodels, that the Pinelands bog asphodels. And, then there's just other ones. There's, little tiny flowers and bigger flowers and so on. I know, Jason, you may add to that.
Well, a good resource is to take the plants class that's often offered at PPA by Russell Julich. I'm not sure if that's going on this year, but in past years, Russell has done a great class and explored all of the great flora of the Pine Barrens. So that's a resource for people to get more involved with. So one other question, Robert asked, what are the rules for walking around off trail?
You know, it's like anything. I mean, when you're off trail, okay. I mean, for one thing, you got to know what you're doing, okay. And then the other thing is you have to be careful because of where you're stepping and knowing what you're doing, because you can get yourself in trouble very quickly. And so you really, I mean, it's know what you're doing, watch where you're going, and know your way back. You know, one thing about the Pinelands being a very flat landscape is that there are no landmarks, and it's amazing how quickly you know, you can get lost by taking few steps off of a trail. Okay, but again, it's like anything. You've got to be very mindful. Um, you know, anybody who's real concerned about the natural environment, no matter where you are, follows the leave no trace principles, which, you know, if you boil it down to one phrase, it's take only pictures, leave only footprints. And so just in the pines, watch where those footprints are. They make sure you're not stepping somewhere where you're going to get in trouble, or you're not stepping on something rare.
Rich, if I can just add to that, there's no law that says where you can and cannot walk on public lands, on state forests and state parks. There are rules about where you can drive a vehicle, and we hope that everybody pays attention and only drives their vehicles on what is clearly a designated road and not into swamps and streams and ponds, which remarkable to say, some people do. You know, I think my sense has always been that nature can accommodate the occasional walker, where it can't necessarily accommodate vehicles with, you know, trucks with tires and ATVs and so on. And you know, for the most part, it's a matter of just being thoughtful about where you're stepping and what you're looking for, both for your own, you know, your own welfare and for that of what you're walking upon. But I think there is no reason not to thoughtfully look to explore places that are not a marked trail and a road. You know, as long as you're careful and you know where you have a clear idea where you are. Part of the joy of the Pine Barrens is finding a spot that maybe nobody has been in for a long time, and that you may be seeing a view that no one has seen before, exactly as it is today.
Now, this leads into the next question. Lynn asked, is there an official map showing what roads are off limits to vehicles on state land? She says, it would help to know where I cannot drive when planning places to photograph.
Oh, Lord, that is an issue that Jason and I and our colleagues at PPA have been struggling over for years, with trying to get the state of New Jersey to provide very clear guidance as to where it is lawful and unlawful to drive. And for reasons that sometimes evade our understanding, that has not yet happened, but I think we are moving towards a point where that will be true, where it'll be very clear where it is, where the landowners, you know, the state of New Jersey in the case of the state parks and forests and wildlife management areas, where they expect you to be driving and not driving. But even when that is true, the proviso is conditions change. And as Rich pointed out, with a water table that is so close to the surface, sometimes a road that was passable last week is not passable this week. And in addition, unfortunately, we see roads that are torn up by irresponsible recreationists and big trucks. And you have to be thoughtful about that and know that when you go out to do an expedition, you may get to a point where you think, you know, it's just not prudent to keep driving here because of the puddles and the water that I see, or because an area has been kind of dug out from the road. So just be prepared for the possibility that you may want to turn around and walk instead of drive.
All right, and here's a two-part question from Janice. This is technical, Rich. When shooting sunsets, I often get a green reflection or light spot from the UV filter. Is there a way to avoid this? And her follow-up was, what kind of neutral density filter do you use the most?
Okay, so if you're getting some kind of odd green spot from your filter, UV filter, that's either a lens flare. I mean, not seeing it, it's hard to identify it. It's either a lens flare, in which case you want to make sure your lenses and your filter are very clean. Sometimes dust spots can cause that. Or you may want to switch from a UV filter to what's known as a protection filter. UV filters have a slight color to them. You know, the idea was back in the days when we used to shoot film, UV filter would cut through haze a little bit. So they have kind of a greenish bluish cast to them. So, but if you switch to what's known as a protection filter, which is just regular glass, that might solve that problem for you, but also just make sure your lenses are clean. I use something called a lens brush. You can buy them for a couple of bucks in a camera shop. And it's just a sort of a soft hair brush that you can, it's almost like the size of a pen. And you can use that to clean dust off your lens, which is, you know, out in the pines, it can be a very dusty area and so on. And what was the second part of that question, Jason?
What do you find you use for neutral density?
Neutral density filter. Yeah, so I use the, you know, I experiment a lot with neutral density filters over the years, and with modern cameras, you know, we used to use what's known as a split or a graduated neutral density filter, where when you had like a lot of light in the sky and a shadowy landscape, you know, it kind of evened out the light. But now I pretty much use a solid neutral density filter. And after a lot of experimenting, particularly in the pines, and I do this to do things like, you know, make the water flow a little better. I mean, if you use a long exposure on flowing water, you get, you know, it can get kind of a glass-like finish, or if you're shooting water flowing over a beaver dam or something, you get this nice kind of soft, silky feel to it. And I find that the number one filter that I use is what's known as a 6-stop neutral density filter. So it basically darkens down to 6 camera exposure stops, so that will slow it down. And I also carry another one that's a 4-stop one, but I rarely use that one. But you know, if I'm really doing, you know, I'm really worrying about weight, if I'm doing a, you know, a long hike or something like that, and I'm going to take a neutral, I'll just take that one 6-stop neutral density filter with me.
And the next question, I'm not sure who asked this, so feel free to chime back in the chat. Any suggestions for folks who have limited mobility but want to explore and photograph the Pinelands?
That is a really, really great question. And there are areas that are accessible to people with limited mobility, and one of the best places is White's Bog. You know, White's Bog is a kind of it's a restored village. It's the area where Elizabeth White first cultivated the blueberry and so on. But if you drive outside of the village, there's a series of absolutely gorgeous bogs that have been left. They at one time were cranberry bogs, and they've been left to restore themselves. And the great thing about White's Bog is that you can drive anywhere on the roads there and get to a spot, get out of your car, and set up your camera and take pictures without having to walk very far. In fact, I had a photography student recently who used a walker. He was an older gentleman and had some issues with his hips and was using a walker. And we went there, and he had a wonderful time because he didn't have to walk that far. And then there are some other locations as well, but you know, White's Bog would be a great place to start.
Can I also chime in here? That's a great question, in part because PPA has just begun working on a project to try to promote understanding of accessibility to nature sites in the Pinelands. We got a grant from the Department of Human Services to work on this, and anyone who is interested in this issue of accessibility, I hope you will email me at carlton@pinelandsalliance.org, and we'll let you know, because we're going to do some town halls on this question of what sites are accessible, what challenges do people see, what ideas do people see where they have some kind of limitation or disability in their ability to get into nature sites, all with the objective of providing, creating a great information hub for people and promoting the development of sites to be more accessible so people can get into real natural areas. And so I really hope that if you're interested in that, you'll get in touch with us and let us know. We'll get back to you and get you involved in that process.
It's a great
And-
project.
Go ahead, Rich.
No, I was going to say that's a great project because I think accessibility is one of the issues out there, and as we can make that better, that's just a great way to get more people out to experience the Pinelands.
And Laurel asked if our presentation is going to be available for someone who couldn't be here today. And I believe we are going to be emailing the recording out. We have been recording this whole presentation. Is that right, Becky?
Yeah, we will email everyone with a link to the recording, but they could view it after this meeting is done because it will exist on our YouTube channel. And that's YouTube. We're known at Pinelands Alliance, and I've posted it in the chat a couple times.
And Ellen wanted to know if photography has been used to further conversation in the Pinelands for visual campaigns or other means.
Well, I mean, this is Carlton again. I'll say the photographers, people like Rich Lewis and Al Horner and many others, have been the greatest ambassadors there are to the Pinelands for people who have not yet explored it personally and directly to see what they can find and see out there. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. I would say it's worth 1,000,000 words when it comes to the kind of work that people have done in the Pinelands. Absolutely, we use people's photography all the time, as you've seen tonight with the people who contributed photographs to our photography show. We are using those pictures to communicate to the world what an extraordinary place this is.
Here's another kind of a gear question, Rich. Lynn kayaks a lot, but she's hesitant to take her good camera and lenses. Do you have any other ideas for taking photos on the river while kayaking or on the lakes and ponds?
Yeah, actually, there are some great cameras that are being produced now that are almost fully waterproof. Yeah, I'm not I don't recommend one camera brand over another because they're all good. However, we recently brought, it's an Olympus camera. It's called a Tough TG6. It's fully waterproof. It's a point and shoot camera, but it takes great pictures. It can shoot in RAW. For those of you who know what that is, and creates really neat images. And you can actually dunk the camera in the water and take pictures. Another thing where if you want to go out there with your good equipment and try and keep it protected is to store it in a waterproof container on the deck of your kayak or inside your canoe, and even use an underwater housing. And you don't have to get one of the big fancy ones that cost thousands of dollars, but there's I think there's something called marine something or other. It's like a big super duper plastic bag that you can put your camera in. It totally seals it up, and there's a glass plate in the front of it so that you can have it doesn't interfere with the resolution of your lens.
And Linda wanted to know, what's the difference between the Pinelands and the Pine Barrens? Is there a difference? What does that mean?
I'll let you guys take that one.
I'll speak to that. The way we try to use the term is that the Pine Barrens is what creation gives us. It's nature. So it is characterized by sandy, porous, acidic soils and water that is also acidic and low in nutrients. That's the Pine Barrens. It creates the forests and the bogs and the cedar swamps that we see. Pinelands is a political creation. It's the set of laws that drew a boundary, that by its nature has some arbitrary features to it. It drew a boundary in which special laws were put in place to try to protect the Pine Barrens. the natural resources. So we try to be, we try to use those terms that way, but for many people, they tend to be interchangeable. But we try to say the Pinelands is like the Pinelands Protection Act, the Pinelands Comprehensive Management Plan, the Pinelands rules, whereas the Pine Barrens, it doesn't necessarily follow all those boundaries that people have put in place. It is what nature gives us.
Okay, and our last question, and feel free to keep asking questions, everybody, but our last question for now is, Rich, do you have any suggestions for getting those fall mist photos? Do you have any kind of network or where people alert each other to when the mist is rising?
You know, there's a lot of theories, and there's a lot of and there's a lot of like predictions, and I'll tell you, you know, my little rules of mist that work all the time except when they don't, and that is there's a couple of things that you can look for, and one is a temperature change between between the early twilight and the middle of the day of more than 20 degrees, high humidity. And if you look at like some of the weather apps that track dew point and temperature, when the dew point and the temperature are equal to each other, those are things. And then the other things, clear skies and no wind are two other things. These are great predictors of mist. And as I said, they work every time except when they don't. It is kind of a fleeting thing. The other thing about mist is you'll find it in some places and then you won't find it in other places. I remember one morning going out to a lake, and I was 100% sure I was going to get wonderful mist on this lake, and not a drop of mist happened. And then when I was driving home, there was mist all over the road and all over the cranberry bogs that I was passing and so on. So, but there wasn't, it wasn't there. So, you know, you can use those as a predictor, but I can't say they work 100% of the time.
Rich, there was a question earlier. Are there guided photography excursions in the Pinelands? Which is also supported by a question from Christine. Will Rich be offering photography workshops or classes in the near future?
The answer to that question is yes, I do offer photography workshops. And I don't know if I can put in a plug for the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, but I do partner with them to do photography workshops in the Franklin Parker Preserve. But I hold other workshops. You know, right now with COVID, we've kind of put things on hold. However, I'm looking to definitely do stuff in the fall and possibly in the late spring. You can find information on my website, which is located at the bottom of this slide that we're looking at now.
And we had one last question. Great Eggman asked, he has many years of interesting photos, but he's had difficulty succeeding with fine art printing, especially with overall system calibration. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with those issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that is really, there's not a quick answer other than the fact that it's always good to calibrate your monitor and calibrate your printer to the monitor. And there's equipment that you can do that. There's a company called Spider Pro. There's another one called i1 and so on, but it's good to research that. And it's not really a question I can answer easily. However, feel free to contact me through my website and I can give you a little bit more insight on that.
Rich, do you want to talk about your upcoming book?
Sure, I would love to. So, so all in all, I mean, I started photographing the Pinelands long time ago. And, you know, it was impossible to find places, you know, I mean, just, you know, nobody knew. And, you know, you would just, you know, I always say, like, we would just drive around till we either got hopelessly lost or we found something really interesting. And so I've kind of taken that experience and over the last 2.5 years have compiled photography locations. And the real guideline to this is that they have to be easy to get to, because there's, you know, there's a lot of us who pride ourselves on, donning a pair of waders and going out and, or, going out into the marshes and the swamps and, other places that you have to hike miles and miles to get to. So I'm looking at places that are have fairly easy access. And I came up with over 50 locations, and I visited every one of those locations, and it's everywhere from the most northern part of the Pinelands, all the way down, to East Point Lighthouse in the south, and compiled those locations, not just giving you directions, but also example photographs. There's going to be over 100 photographs in this book. Exactly where good locations to shoot from are with GPS coordinates, recommended equipment, whether it's good for a wide angle lens or telephoto lens and so on. And, a couple little stories here and there. And there's also a whole instructional section in the very beginning that talks about much of what we covered this evening, but with a little bit more detail. And that book, hopefully it's in its final phases, and it will hopefully be ready for release sometime in the spring.
Great. Thank you. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of the show, and I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and certainly like to thank Pinelands Preservation Alliance for putting this all together, Becky and Carlton and Steve. I think it's been a terrific show, and of course, Rich for doing an outstanding job. So good night, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon. We're going to have some shorter videos coming out that we'll notify you about concerning the Pinelands. So stay safe and good night.